No doctor wants to be on strike.
I said to Wes Streeting very, very clearly, we can do a deal.
Why are resident doctors planning to strike?
Two things. Jobs. We do need to see our pay restored.
That whole new issue of the unemployment crisis.
There's clearly a crisis amongst doctors being unemployed across the UK.
There have been a lot of talks with Wes Streeting recently.
We haven't seen any concrete proposals. The government are not willing to discuss pay. There's nothing credible to be able to put to members, which is why we have no choice but to go on strike. The government wouldn't talk about pay.
What are we actually looking for?
I'm here to do a deal. I've said that to Wes Streeting. That number is not some made up number.
What is it that we're asking for?
£18 an hour to just over £22 an hour.
£22 an hour for someone with 5 years of training, probably about £100,000 of student debt, and the responsibility in people's lives.
Yes.
This couldn't really be worse news for what we are trying to accomplish.
That's very much not just a bump in the road, it's a U-turn.
This isn't a all or nothing negotiation.
We have to return to the picket line. The government have literally U-turned on a commitment to restore pay.
No doctor wants to be on strike.
I said to Wes Streeting very, very clearly, we can do a deal.
Hi, my name is Dr Arthur and I'm here today with Jack Fletcher, who is the chair of the Resident Doctors Committee branch of the BMA. We're going to be talking all things strikes. Jack, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I'm Jack Fletcher and I'm the recently elected chair of the UK Resident Doctors Committee within the BMA, and I look after all the resident doctors in England and represent them in negotiations with the government.
Fantastic. When we say recently elected, how long have you been in this role?
So I landed in the role at the end of September, so I've been doing this for just over a month now, when we took over negotiations and we're moving things forward.
Fantastic. And just for a bit of context as to your role, whereabouts are you in your medical training at the moment?
So I work as an IMT3 equivalent, so that is working in acute medicine in the northeast of England, looking after patients who come through the acute medical unit, focusing on geriatrics and acutely unwell patients.
I suppose the first question, just to outline why we're here doing this discussion, is why are resident doctors planning to strike?
So this is about two things. The first one is about jobs. So we've got unemployed doctors up and down this country. We've got doctors who can't get specialty training places to get on in their careers. They can't progress to be the surgeons, the GPs, the specialists of the future. And also we still face a huge amount of pay erosion, and we are in dispute with the government over pay to make progress to restoring our pay back to what it was in 2008. Our job is no less difficult than it was in 2008, and I would argue it's probably more difficult, and all we're asking for is to be paid just as we were in 2008. We can talk and we can negotiate over how long that takes or what that looks like, but we are firm in that we do need to see our pay restored.
That's it. So I think the key difference from what I'm seeing from these strikes compared to the last ones is that that's that whole new issue of the unemployment crisis. So for a doctor like ourselves who's just completed FY2 training, which is the 2 years after medical school, if you don't get into specialty training, what are your options?
So if you don't get into specialty training, there's a range of options, but the challenge that we've got at the moment is the NHS is under huge financial pressure from a trust point of view. So what we're seeing is a jobs market which is drying up. If you can't get a specialty training place, what that means is you can't get on with your career. So you're essentially stuck both in terms of career progression and pay, and regardless of the experience that you pick up, you are stuck at that level until you can get a specialty training place. And those jobs are not as forthcoming as they once were. We're seeing competition ratios for those jobs in the hundreds of applications for every one job, and there's clearly a crisis amongst doctors being unemployed across the UK.
So there have been a lot of talks with Wes Streeting recently, who has come out with various statements about these strikes, what they are and aren't willing to negotiate on. In a recent interview, he said there's a deal available to be done right now. What have the government already offered?
So the government have offered various different things. They've offered a deal that can be done right now on jobs. I'm not entirely sure what that means, because there's nothing credible that's come forward on jobs, and we're open to negotiate various different things to fix the specialty training crisis. But we haven't seen any concrete proposals. We haven't seen implementation date, how long things are going to take to bring in, how long they're going to take effect, and therefore there's nothing credible to be able to put to members, which is why we have no choice but to go on strike. And that's on the jobs front. On the pay front, the government are not willing to discuss pay. They're willing to discuss a whole range of other things, but they're not willing to discuss pay, which is a big problem given this is a pay dispute.
That's it. So pay's been taken completely off the table, but jobs-wise, they've not really committed to X number of jobs with any kind of time frame. It is just potential things. Is that about where we are?
It's just discussions. There have been constructive talks, but there isn't something that I can put to members across the country today, and that's why we've had no choice but to call for industrial action.
Wes Streeting did imply that there are things he can do right now, but it sounds like that's not the case.
So Wes Streeting has said that he does not want to spend £250 million on strike action. We think that money and more can be better invested in getting doctors back to work this year and coming up with a credible solution to that jobs crisis going forward. And what is on the table is nothing concrete. We are yet to see when these things will be implemented. We don't have a deal to put to members, and ultimately there is nothing. There are going to be tens of thousands of doctors applying for jobs right now for 2026, and I haven't seen a proposal that will fix the problem to stop tens of thousands of those doctors being turned away from working in the NHS from 2026 onwards.
So he did also imply in the same interview that they don't have £250 million to spend on the strikes. That to me implies that if the strikes do go ahead, both job negotiations and pay negotiations are off the table. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, holding jobs hostage from patients, holding doctors from patients is interesting. We don't think a single penny needs to be spent on industrial action. What we need is the government to start talking about solutions this year on both jobs and pay. That will avoid the strike action. Not a single penny needs to be spent on industrial action. We've said that, but there's nothing credible on the table yet.
With regards to the training places crisis, what would we be expecting from the government? What would make a substantive offer that we would consider putting to members?
Look, it's a complex problem that's arisen from decades worth of inadequate workforce planning. This is not going to be solved right now overnight, but what we do need to see is significant movement this year on fixing that problem. There are a number of things that we think could go some way to fixing this problem. Things like increasing the number of training places, making sure that we're not going to create a problem in 5 years' time when we've got too many consultants and they end up going elsewhere, or too many GPs. That would be an interesting situation to be in, but we've got unemployed GPs at the moment because we're in that exact situation. We think things like UK graduate prioritisation, with prioritising international colleagues who have significant experience in the NHS, would go some way to fixing this crisis. And there are other things that we could be looking at. There are employment guarantees for nurses and midwives. That could be something that we discuss. There are various different avenues that we could pursue to fix this problem, but what we need to see is movement further and faster, not in a few years' time, and proposals that aren't going to shift the needle this year.
That's it. So we are not looking for an immediate answer now. I agree that would be unreasonable. We are looking for that good faith and that willing to make changes right now to affect this cohort of doctors applying to training in the next couple of weeks, months' time.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm with you. You've mentioned about the international medical graduates, and this is a hot topic. There is a concern that prioritising UK graduates will, in a way, force out current IMGs, international medical graduates, that are currently working in the UK. Let's just talk a little bit about that, how that might look if we were to prioritise UK trained graduates.
So the BMA policy, which has been agreed by many different branches of practice, consultants, GPs, resident doctors, medical students, is to prioritise UK graduates for specialty training places, but also to prioritise those international colleagues who have significant experience in the NHS. And all that would do is bring us in line with many other countries in the world, so Canada, Australia, America, where they prioritise graduates from their own universities. However, we recognise that we've got a huge number of IMGs in the NHS who make a significant contribution to the NHS. And what we're saying is we don't want to suddenly bring in a policy that's going to disadvantage huge numbers of doctors. We need doctors. And what we're saying is we should be prioritising those doctors who are currently in the NHS rather than poaching doctors from other countries and bringing them in and spending millions of pounds doing so. Let's invest in the doctors that currently work in the NHS.
So international medical graduates that are currently practicing NHS don't need to be worried about their jobs or about, deportation, things like that comes up. They, as long as they're in the NHS before this is brought in, will be relatively safe employment-wise.
Look, I've got colleagues who I work with on my rota, and 4 out of 6 doctors on my rota are international colleagues. 2 of them have children who were born in the UK. They came over during COVID to help fix, help get the country through the pandemic.
Yeah.
I would absolutely not be advocating for those doctors to be facing any level of detriment. But what I do think we need to do is be prioritising graduates from the UK and colleagues like the ones that I work with to make sure that we fix this problem, because like I said, this is decades in the making, and we appreciate that a sudden switch overnight is not going to fix this. What we're asking for is to make sure there's a fair solution to this on multiple fronts.
So we've talked a lot about the strikes, why we're doing them, what the issues are. What are we actually looking for from the government to change, to give more jobs? What are the limiting factors to stopping us just creating more specialty training positions?
I mean, that's a great question, because the government have been willing to discuss various different things which cost money. However, what we are asking for is more training numbers. We need more training numbers. We need investment and more funding in those training numbers. We need proper workforce planning to make sure that when those training numbers come along, there are jobs at the other end of the training programme for consultants, specialists, GPs. We're asking for a variety of things. We talked about UK graduate prioritisation, as well as prioritising colleagues with significant NHS experience. We're asking for investment into those training programmes so that we're not just service provision. We're asking for investment into doctors, just like they did in Wales. In England, I don't think doctors in England are worth less than in Wales, and they've seen a 4% additional investment in things like various different contract reforms. That's what we're asking for. We are going on strike because that is what we're asking for, and the government just don't seem to be listening.
I'm with you. So we aren't just picking things out the air. There are very definable things that we are asking for. More funding for training places. We are asking for UK prioritisation as well, and also recognising that NHS experience. So if they were hypothetically to offer those things, that'd be a big step in the right direction.
Absolutely. I'm here to do a deal. I've said that to Wes Streeting, and I'm very, very keen to do a deal on both jobs and pay, but that has to work for doctors. That is not just talks about talks. Those are actual talks that lead to meaningful change this year and potentially in the years to come to fix this problem with jobs and pay. Jobs and pay are very much both on the agenda, and we want to see solutions to both of them, not jobs being held hostage or no movement on the other.
I'm with you. So just talk us through, right back to basics, how have the BMA calculated our pay restoration, where we should be versus where we are?
So we use something called RPI as a measure of inflation. So inflation is the cost of goods and services going up every single year. The government's target, the Bank of England's target, is 2% every year. So just to keep your pay at the same value, you need a 2% pay rise every year, essentially. Now, the BMA uses RPI because the government uses RPI when it chooses to, and the government uses CPI when it chooses to. We've been consistent. We use RPI because the value of my student loan is based on RPI. So the the £20,000 of interest that's been added to my student loan because of my 5-year degree has been added because the interest is based on RPI, which is a measure of inflation. That's why we've used it. It's a valid measure of inflation. The BMA's used it. We've taken the point of 2008, done some very complex maths, which is all done by our economics team, and we've ended up with a figure, and we are now still 20.9% down when we use RPI compared to what our pay was in 2008.
So all we are trying to get is just to where the pay was. We are not asking for it to be paid more in real terms, just back to that 2008 level, if that's correct.
Exactly, and that number is not some made up number. Doctors were actually valued and paid at that value in 2008. It's not some fantasy number that we've just dreamt up. It is a real pounds per hour number that existed in 2008. And all we're saying is we don't think the job's any easier. We think it's harder. We've got a huge number of challenges that we've been talking about for a little while now. And what we're asking for is doctors to be valued as they were in 2008. It's not a made up number. It is a real actual value, and we think it's reasonable.
Absolutely. And actually, when you work out pounds per hour, the percentages kind of almost over-egg it, we are talking about pounds per hour, we're not talking about an insane number. What would it be for an F1, so a year out of medical school? The pay was £14, 8p I think when I was an F1. We then got an element of pay restoration that went to about £18. What is it that we're asking for?
So we're asking to move from £18.60 an hour to just over £22 an hour. So, you know, you could calculate that in various different ways. You can talk about valuing doctors overnight. You can talk about valuing the doctors who work overtime every single week. And you can also talk about getting rid of any sort of strikes for the next couple of years by saying, yeah, what we'll do is a deal which goes from £18 an hour to just over £22 an hour. It's £4 an hour more for a fully qualified doctor in the UK working in the NHS, and that's what we're asking for.
So we're asking for £22 an hour for someone with 5 years of training, probably about £100,000 of student debt, and the responsibility of people's lives.
Yes, and you know, the government could get around the table and they could see an end to these strikes for as little as £1 an hour extra over the next few years.
And there's been some interesting news actually today on the day of filming. I appreciate these videos will go out a little bit later. Just tell us a little bit about what those developments have been, which I'm sure will maybe develop further by the time this is edited and put out.
So the government today have suggested a 2% real terms pay cut for doctors, and Wes Streeting talks about restoring pay as a journey. I don't think anyone on that journey expected to face a real terms pay cut along the way. That's very much not just a bump in the road, it's a U-turn towards the opposite direction where our pay was being eroded over the last 14 years or so.
Sure, so let's just jump into the figures slightly. So this year, how much would we have been expecting just to keep up with inflation to ensure that we didn't have a real terms pay cut?
So inflation right now, RPI inflation is 4.5%. The government have suggested that for 2026, 2027, they can afford a 2.5% pay rise. So that's essentially a real terms pay cut of 2%, because 4.5% minus 2.5% is 2. And that's essentially the real terms pay cut that doctors will be facing in the next year, proposed by the government.
And the figure we have for pay restoration has essentially come from putting all those numbers, compounding them since 2008, which comes out in the 40s%. Obviously, it's changing year on year, and as you say, it's a progressive issue that is only building with time if we don't just keep up with inflation. So currently, where we are, as you say, is taking a little bit of a U-turn, and actually, it's adding to that deficit. We're asking for them to catch up with it over time, whether that's in one big lump deal, which it probably won't be, or if it's just a multi-year pay deal. This couldn't really be worse news for what we are trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and you know, there are a lot of different ways that you can do it, and we're willing to explore those with the government. You know, things like recognising out of hours pay, time and a half, things like talking about additional hours, the compulsory overtime that full-time doctors work, which is 8 hours on average every single week. You could value overtime at a time and a half. First year doctors, who are the first people on scene to restart people's hearts, let's pay them time and a half. You could talk about the compulsory overtime that we work, which is up to 8 hours every single week, valuing that at time and a half. I don't think valuing overtime at a time and a half is an unreasonable ask. We could be talking about as little as £1 an hour over the next few years. We're open to negotiate, but the challenge is when one side isn't willing to negotiate and is advocating for real terms pay cuts, and the other side, the BMA, is willing to talk about various different options, that becomes an incredibly difficult negotiation, which is why we've genuinely been left with no choice but to go back to the picket lines until the government is willing to get serious about the problems that we're facing.
I think it's a really interesting point. This isn't a binary argument. This isn't a all or nothing negotiation. You said from the BMA, from the resident doctor side of things, we are willing to negotiate on these things. There are many different things that would some way bridge that gap between where we are now and where we want to be. What are some of the other things that potentially could be on the table in terms of pay negotiation that's not necessarily directly pay, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so I mean, there's lots of things that the government have talked about. The government have talked about funding exams, which are thousands of pounds for doctors, but they're once in a career events. They are significant expenses, but they're once in a career events. They've talked about things like indemnity costs, so that's the cost to protect yourself as a doctor. They've talked about other various different aspects of non-pay items, but the reality is that doesn't fix the pay erosion that we've had, and we can negotiate, but again, the challenge is when the government are just unwilling to talk about pay in any form, that becomes a very difficult negotiation, and that's why we've said unless you're willing to talk about pay and fixing the jobs crisis, we have to return to the picket line. If Mr. Streeting wants to come forward and invite us to the table to talk about those things and put a credible offer to us, I would be very, very willing to accept that. The challenge is when we've seen today the government have literally U-turned on a commitment to restore pay, that becomes very, very difficult.
Wes Streeting has said in an interview, as we've discussed before, that pay is off the table. Where did those negotiations end?
So the negotiations ended when I asked the government if that was their best and final offer, and they said yes, and I put that to the Resident Doctors Committee, and it wasn't credible enough. I think it is not credible enough, and therefore we have ended up in this position where we are taking industrial action because those negotiations didn't produce an offer that was credible.
So what was that percentage?
So there wasn't a real percentage because the government wouldn't talk about pay.
Right.
They also wouldn't come up with a credible solution on jobs. So we had a discussion with the government. We said what we thought was reasonable. I've published that in a recent email.
Yeah.
We said what we thought was credible on jobs, and the government came back with some non-concrete proposals on jobs and said that they wouldn't discuss pay, they would discuss a whole range of other areas, and therefore the way out of a pay dispute is not to talk about pay, and the way out of a jobs dispute is to get doctors who are unemployed back looking after patients and getting them progressing through their career towards registrar, consultant and GP jobs.
And with you, so essentially the pay offer for this round of strikes stopped kind of before it even started. We haven't had a credible pay offer.
Yes, essentially. So the pay offer was not a pay offer, it was an offer on various other elements of doctors' expenses.
So Wes Streeting said in a recent interview that these strikes will cause harm to patients. Can you tell us a little bit about if patients will get harmed as a result of these strikes?
So during the doctor's strike, just like during the previous strikes, emergency and urgent care will not be affected. We have senior colleagues, senior doctors who will be ready in A&Es, in acute medical units across the country to step in when resident doctors go on strike. What we do see is patients coming to harm every single day in the NHS because the waiting lists are huge. People can't get to see their GP, and yet we've got an unemployment crisis of doctors, and what we see is patients coming to harm because they can't access that medical care because doctors are unemployed. Doctors are literally sat at home applying for jobs because they are unemployed, and that is why patients are coming to harm. We're asking for a credible solution to fix that works for both patients and doctors.
And with this, that emergency skeleton service that will help people life or limb will be there throughout strikes, but it is that elective, less time sensitive problems such as the long waiting lists that potentially would get delayed more, but we're striking so those lists will come down eventually.
Exactly, and we've put solutions forward to fix that. All we need is the government to invest in that rather than spending money on industrial action. More than happy to talk about how we can stop the harm that's coming to patients every day in the NHS. What we need is the government to come to the table with something credible.
We've talked about Australia, Canada, America, all these countries that are very willingly accepting UK trained doctors that can't get employment here. I think one of the big advantages that the NHS currently has is that geographically these places are very far away, and a lot of the things keeping people in the UK aren't the health service, but they are friends and family and their lives here. If hypothetically Australia was where France is, do you think we'd have any doctors left?
I think we'd see a mass exodus, but I think it very much depends on their love of cheese.
Yeah.
I'd certainly be considering it.
I think that's it. I think for me and a lot of my friends who are still in the UK, the fact that our friends are here, the fact that our families, the fact that our life is here is one of the main things. But actually, Australia's a 24-hour flight, and that's probably one of the only barriers to a lot of people leaving, which is sort of quite stark to imagine. And if we do flip it on its head and imagine France was an English-speaking country with a similar healthcare system to us, then you probably have a lot less doctors.
Yeah, and when I graduated as a doctor, I wanted to treat patients. I still want to treat patients.
Yeah.
I really enjoy treating patients in my acute medical unit. It's hugely satisfying. The really unsatisfying part is the fact that a lot of my colleagues can't progress in their careers. They can't get on and be the surgeons that they want to be. They can't get on and be the A&E doctors that they want to be, or the GPs that they want to be. And patients want more GPs, more A&E doctors, more surgeons. We are an under-doctored country, and yet we've got the government who are refusing to come up with a credible plan to deliver that.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I think that's the thing. No doctor wants to be on strike. There's not a single doctor that is willing these strikes to go on. It is uncomfortable for us. It is hard being in the public eye, not as trusted professionals, because that's essentially what we want to do. We want to be helping patients. We want to be in the hospitals, in GP practices, doing our job. The last thing we want to do is prolong these strikes. If an incredible offer is put on the table, it'll be put forward to the members, I imagine.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in terms of, I do not want to be on strike. I said to Wes Streeting very, very clearly, we can do a deal. We can move this issue forward. This is a last resort.
So, for any doctors watching this that are maybe on the fence about taking part in the upcoming industrial action, what would your message be?
My message is, let's fix the specialty training crisis. Let's be valued as our colleagues were in 2008. Take strike action. We are asking everyone to act. We don't do it lightly. We understand the implication of it, but your action does move the dial. It did in 2024 and it will again.
What would your message be to Wes Streeting and the government as to why we're doing these strikes and what we're asking for?
My message is, these strikes are avoidable. What we need is credible movement right now on jobs. We've got thousands of doctors who are facing unemployment in the next 12 months. Let's work on a plan. Let's get something credible over the line, and let's value doctors as they were in 2008. That can be a journey, not an event. However, there does need to be progress towards that destination.
I think that about covers everything, Jack. Thank you very much for your time today. I know you're a very busy man. You've been literally up and down the country for the last week or two, and I don't imagine that's going to stop anytime soon. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been very informative. Please leave any questions you have in the comments, and either myself, Jack, or another BMA member will try to answer them as best we can. If it's something we can do future videos on, then absolutely we will. I don't think this will be our last chat. Hopefully you'll join us at the industrial action to make these strikes as strong as we can so that we have as few strikes as possible. We want to solve this issue. We want to make the NHS better for patients, but we can't do that with the current conditions and the current employment crisis the doctors are facing.